She entered class ready to teach, not to battle for her dignity. To her students, she was no different than any other teacher, but to one boy, the color of her skin rendered her a target. In 1 second, his rage grew violent, his hand clamping around her neck. What he didn't realize was that she wore a past no one had anticipated, a past that would alter everything. This wasn't about a fight in a classroom. It was about respect, power, and a reality too many still choose to not acknowledge. The question is, what if silence is no longer possible? For most of the students, she was more than an instructor. She was a guiding hand, a voice of calm, and a unique individual who believed in them when the world did not. Ms. Carter, a black woman who had served her country before entering the classroom, moved with quiet strength. She wore discipline like armor, though few were aware of where it came from. To her students, she was merely Miss, the one who never shouted, the one who lingered late to assist with essays and homework others had long since abandoned. But respect is never guaranteed. Beneath the fluorescent lights of her classroom, whispers of resentment brewed. One student, restless and angry, saw not a teacher, but a target. And while she prepared lessons to shape the future, he was preparing something far darker. What neither of them knew was that their worlds were about to collide in a way that no textbook could ever explain. At first, it was insidious, giggles when she was turned away, low-key muttering that was just out of reach of being disciplined. Ms. Carter knew better. She knew what youth rage looked like when it lacked direction, how prejudice could quietly build up. But this was different. It wasn't mere teenage defiance. It was more pointed, heavier, aimed squarely at her. The boy himself, Jason, walked with an air of arrogance and fury. Tall for his age, agitated in his seat, always testing limits. Where others found her gentle presence stabilizing, he resented it. To him, she was a provocation, power he couldn't respect, wrapped in flesh he'd been conditioned to hate. The first actual confrontation occurred during a routine reading exercise. Jason would not cooperate, arms folded, a smile tugging at his lips. When she asked him to attempt it, he said something under his breath. The room fell silent. She did not ask him to say it again, but the words hung like a fog. All the students overheard. Some squirmed in their chairs. Some glared at their desktops. Miss Carter stood firm, correcting him in the same cool voice she used for all people. But within, she felt the all-too-familiar burn, that stinging reminder that to some, her very humanity would always be called into question before her teacher status was ever recognized. Days went by, and the strain only intensified. Jason started to turn up late, disrupting class, challenging her to do something about it. She remained firm, but fissures were beginning to form. She could sense the pupils' eyes on her, waiting for someone to crack. Respect, previously tenuous, now hung in the balance on a knife's edge. And then came the incident that would tip the balance. A Friday afternoon, the air thick with the agitated tension of students clamoring for the weekend. Miss Carter was scribbling on the board when a sudden bang resounded through the room. Jason had pushed his desk violently into the floor, the noise yanking everyone to attention. She spun around, prepared to rebuke him, but his eyes flamed with something more sinister than rebellion. He stood tall, shoulders braced, stepping forward as though the classroom was his alone. The chuckling that typically ensued after his hijinks did not materialize this time. The silence was deafening compared to any bellow. Hundreds of eyes darted between teacher and student, the tension crushingly oppressive. Miss Carter's heart was racing, but her expression was still in control. This was no longer simply about discipline. This was about survival. Hers, and the tenuous structure she had struggled to construct. Jason edged closer, spewing insults that grew sharper with every step. He hoped to snap her, to make her crack, to gain the pleasure of being able to prove her unfaithful. But what nobody in the room was aware of, at least not yet, was that Ms. Carter had experienced threats much more dangerous than a taunting teenager. Nevertheless, under the shadow of his looming presence, one thing broke through the serenity she held on to. How far would he go? The space in the room constricted as Jason bridged the gap. His tone increased, laced with disdain, words that were intended to shame. Then, in a flash, the boundary was pushed past. His hand lashed out, closing around Ms. Carter's throat. The classroom was filled with gasps. Desks creaked as students rocked back, frozen in shock, faces ashen with terror. Time crawled for an instant. The burden of history weighed heavily in that room. Centuries of power twisted into violence, now acted out on the body of a woman who had devoted herself to service, only to be brought down to a target by a boy who believed her skin made her less. The sear of his grasp was genuine, but more profound was the sear of injustice, the unadorned reminder that respect could be taken from a man in a moment. But Ms. Carter was not delicate. Under the serene face lived years of training, discipline, and survival. The same hands that used to bear texts had also borne guns, her body once conditioned to endure much worse than this. During the quiet of her students' shock, she moved, not with fright, but with exactness. Her hand came up, hard and controlled, shattering his hold with training strength. Jason reeled backward, eyes wide, his swagger undone in an instant. The room exploded, cries, screams, the screech of chairs, but Ms. Carter remained upright, chest heaving, eyes fixed not on her attacker, but on each student witnessing it. She wasn't merely defending herself. She was demonstrating to them, in the moment, the price of hatred and the strength of resilience. And in that suspended breath, one thing cut through the noise. This wasn't just about a classroom fight. This was about what happens when silence is confused with weakness, and what happens when strength finally speaks. When the principal burst in and pulled Jason out of the room, the pandemonium finally erupted. Some students wept. Others hushed over each other in shock. But all of them had witnessed something they would never forget. A teacher having to fend for herself, not merely from a student's fists, but from the cruel reality that still exists in our schools, our streets, our society. Ms. Carter stood tall, but the burden weighed heavily. She understood that this moment would haunt her, etched into her career, her reputation, her sense of mind. But beneath the bite of unfairness, she also understood this. She had not been broken. She had been as strong in the face of hate as she had been on battlefields years and years before a classroom ever challenged her. But the learning stopped at the bell. For each student in that classroom, the memory of Jason's anger and Ms. Carter's defiance would remain. They had seen not only a standoff, but a reality America still does not want to confront. That racism isn't something in the past. It's now. It's present. And it molds lives in ways too many would prefer not to see. The tale of that day isn't a story of one student and one teacher. It's a story of every empty hallway, every room, every workplace where dignity can be taken away in the blink of an eye because of the color of someone's skin. And so the question still remains, how many more classrooms? How many more moments of silence taken for weakness? How many more stories like this before we realize that respect is never something to be earned, that dignity is non-negotiable? Because until we do, the next Ms. Carter is already standing in front of her class waiting.